Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for joining us this evening and giving us a little bit of time out of your Friday evening. It's been beautiful up here in Northwest Montana. Hopefully it's been beautiful wherever you are to kick off our weekend. And we're all kind of in a strange time right now, so it's nice that we have these channels to work through and maybe have a moment of respite and look at some flowers together and just kind of take a breather from everything going on around us. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about flowers for the next 30, 40 minutes and see what comes up. Um, so just a little background on myself. My name is Kyle Gallaher. I'm originally from North Georgia, and I'm cutting off all comments about not having a Southern accent for this talk. It's something that always comes up, but I am in fact from Georgia. And in 2017, I graduated from Arizona State University with a degree in business and psychology, and then decided that I wanted to become a park ranger. And through that, realizing that I didn't have the natural sciences background that's a little bit more typical for this career path, I joined AmeriCorps, and I was able to go to upstate New York and work in the Finger Lakes district as an environmental educator. And then that took me to Northwest Montana, where I got to serve a second term with AmeriCorps with Montana State Parks up in the Kalispell area. And then after that, I got to go to Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks and work in education there. And that brings us to now where I am in Glacier National Park as a ranger for the summer here. And I tell you that to kind of give you some preface on why I chose this topic, why I chose wildflowers. And the reason why is because they're essentially everywhere. They're everywhere that I've been so far. They're eye-catching, they're beautiful, they're just they're part of every ecosystem. There's something that everyone wants to know about and they're exciting. But one of my favorite things is that they don't move. And it makes it really nice to be able to get up close and personal with these flowers because you're not going to run them off. You have to be worried about trampling them. But other than that, you can spend as much time as you need just investigating and understanding and taking in as many clues as possible. It's great. And an added bonus is the fact that if you're out hiking and you maybe need a break, it's always a great excuse to be like, oh, I wonder what that is. So wildflowers is our topic, and we're talking a little bit about identifying them. And this talk isn't necessarily just a setup to say exactly what everything is, but hopefully to give you some resources and maybe some base knowledge where you can start to pick out families. Everything's going to fall into a family, and they are in a family because they're sharing similar traits. So it kind of gives you a base knowledge to start being able to work through things. So I am going to move my screen over to a PowerPoint, and we're going to start to work through this. So some resources that I really, well, let me make sure that I'm sharing my screen first. There we go. All right, so we're going to start just by thinking about some resources first. And these are ones that I use commonly. That doesn't mean that they're going to work for you or that you like them or that you have to use them. The best part is there are so many resources right at our fingertip, and you can kind of work through what is working for you and maybe try something different. That being said, if you have a flower or plant field guide nearby and you kind of want to thumb through it as we go through this, grab it, go for it, and see what you think if things are lining up with what you have going on in your guide. So resources that I use a lot, iNaturalist is a great app and website that has a lot of great minds behind it. It's kind of a community science-based project. They have a phone app and a website, like I just said, but the problem that I have sometimes with that is you do need some sort of connectivity. And that doesn't mean that I don't snap pictures while I'm out and about and run them through the app later, because it has a great what is this tab when you upload a picture. It takes in your geolocation and some other quantifiers, and then spits out some ideas on what it thinks it is. So you can certainly take pictures and run it back through that later, but it's kind of hit or miss. It's usually pretty right, and the other good thing about it is that the fact that it is community based, so there are other experts worked in there that are kind of helping you tab through things when you're not quite sure what you're looking at. So iNaturalist is one that I use a ton. I also use field guides, like physical book field guides, quite a bit. You can get them for every broad region, every part of the world, every little niche that you can possibly find. They're great, but sometimes they're kind of heavy and I don't want to lug around a bunch of things. It's hard for me to say, I'm just going to go out and look at birds, or I'm just going to go out and look at plants on this one day. So I end up lugging all these different field guides around with me. So sometimes I just leave them at home and come back to reference when I need them. Another site that I use a lot is the Montana State Field Guide website. They have a lot of really great comprehensive data, and it breaks it down into everything from animals to plants to insects and everything in between. So that's a really great one for Montana in particular. And then plant specific, there's the Montana Plant Life website. That's also a really great one website wise. Local Facebook groups. This is one that I've started kind of toying with in the last year or so as I've been moving around a lot. There is some good ones out there that you can kind of get plugged into, and it's great because there's conversation there. And I found that I always learn a lot by picking up on what people are talking about. What kind of field marks are people recognizing when they're out identifying things? So if you're on Facebook and that's part of your gig, then give it a shot, see what happens. There's usually a Facebook group for every region and of every state. Speaking from a park ranger aspect, your rangers and natural resource experts in your area are also always a great resource for you. From my perspective, we love answering questions about what people are out there seeing. And then what I really want to talk about today and what I'm super excited about is a book called Botany in a Day by Thomas Elpel. And this book, which is what we're kind of going to base today's talk off of, it breaks plants down by family, and it kind of keys you in on these different identifiers and traits that you're going to find pretty solidly from plant to plant. So that's what we're going to work through. And this is not to say that this is all the resources out there. I'm sure a lot of you that are watching also have really great resources, and it's fun to share that around. So maybe if you have some other great ones in mind and you want to throw it in our chat box later and want to share, go for it. But because we're going to kind of work through the basics of botany in a day in this chat, I'm going to start us with just a little bit of basic plant anatomy, because when we start to go through it and look at plant families and how we're distinguishing them, we're going to start with a little bit of anatomy, and we're not going to get deep into the weeds with all of it. We're just going to keep it simple. And the very first one is, of course, the petals. This is most often what we're seeing, what's catching our eye. Their job is to attract things and bring things in most often. So they're obviously the part that is going to be noticeable. They can be colorful, they can have patterns, all different sizes, all of that. So the petals, it's the part on the outside, usually contains the colors. The next part that I want to point out is the sepal. And the sepal is the part that's underneath. Usually they look like leaves, kind of the green part underneath the petals, providing a little bit of support. And I want to point that out because it comes into a family that we're going to talk about in a little bit once we start rolling with our plant families. So we have the petals on the top, we have the sepals underneath. The next that I want to point out is the pistil. And the pistil is the kind of like the female reproductive part of our flower. And I've been keyed in from a video about how to remember this as pistil packing mamas. So your pistil is the part, the female anatomy of the plant. So that's the part that's trying to grab onto pollen and whatnot coming by or being dropped by pollinators. And then next would be the stamen, and that's the male anatomy of our flower. and stamen, stamen. So we have pistil pack and mamas for our female, and we have stamen for the male parts. So that's pretty much the only parts that we're going to cover. We don't need to get into everything else because those are really mostly you're only looking at really 4 things when you're just kind of grossly, quickly trying to key out families or identify certain species. So the next step of all of this is going to be, whether something is a monocotyledon or a dicotyledon. And that's basically just telling us how many leaves are shooting up after a seed has been planted and it's starting to germinate and come up. Are you going to get 1 leaf that's coming up, or are you going to have 2 leaves that are coming up? And while that seems kind of simple, it does key us into a couple different clues about where things fall. So when you break down the word mono, we're going to start with the monocot side of this chart. Mono meaning 1, cotyl meaning seed, and don meaning leaf. So that's 1 leaf seed. And they tend to kind of fall in the same kind of characteristics. So they tend to have those long, narrow leaves. They have parallel veins that are running the entirety. And what I mostly like about this chart is that it mentions that the floral parts are in multiples of 3. So the parts that we're looking at on the flowers are going to fall in multiples of 3. So it could be 3 petals, 3 sepals, 6 stamen. It's just going to fall in that pattern normally. And I want to point out at this point that I'm going to say usually, normally, most of the time, a lot, because in the world of nature, you can say things happen 99.9% of the time, all the time, but there's always going to be that oddball. There's always going to be that one quirky one on the outside that just kind of throws it all off. So this is a usual science. We're just going to work with what we have here. So moving from the monocot to the dicot side, this is where we're seeing 2 leaves that are coming up at our germination time. They usually have a broader, more complex leaf. They have a network of veins, so if you can imagine like a mesh of veins being laid over. And then we have the floral parts that come in multiples of 4 or 5. So this is when you start to see flowers that might have 5 petals and like 15 stamen packed in the middle. So hopefully that's kind of making sense in that flow. The main things that we're looking at, especially in this talk, is just the floral parts and what they're multiple, how many are they coming in? And then you can kind of start to think back, is it a monocot or is it a dicot? And it just gives you a little bit of extra clues on what's going on. And it also helps you start to think in early spring, depending where you are, if you're in an area that's dealing with snow melt, and you're having this exposed ground and things are starting to germinate and sprout, and you're seeing either 1 leaf or 2 leaf, and you're already kind of predicting what's going to happen. So a lot of this is just building that knowledge. It's like a puzzle, putting the pieces together and kind of predicting what you might get. So with that, we're going to focus on the 8 core families. And the book Botany in a Day is pretty extensive. It covers a lot of great stuff, but when we get down to it in a kind of quicker method, there are 8 core families that a lot of our plants fall into. And those families are mint, mustard, aster, rose, pea, lily, grass, which we'll think about that for a second, and parsley. And saying that, we're going to talk about 7 of them because grass technically has a flowering part on it. They're wind dispersed seeds. That's their shtick. We're going to let them have that and just understand that they do fall into the core families, but we want to, not that grass isn't lovely, but we're out to identify some really showy, eye-catching things, and we'll just trust that the grass has its own thing going on. So we'll focus on the other 7 families. And the first one that we're going to look at is the mustard family. And I like the mustard family. They are relatively simple. Sometimes you might hear them called the brassica family. Everything that we talk about today is going to be in common names. We're not going to get into anything scientific just for the sake of simplicity. And when I'm having conversations with people, we're talking in common names, and it just makes it a bit easier and friendlier. So with the mustard family, these are all patterns, which doesn't mean that something could fall outside of that. So this is what we're typically seeing. And these images are coming from Botany in a Day, and they're pretty good. Like, they're straight to the point. They're telling you what's going on and what you're going to look for. So those primary characteristics of plants, flowering plants in the mustard family, is that they're going to have 4 petals. And those petals will typically be arranged in an H shape or an X shape. Now that I'm saying that, I'm realizing that it would be kind of hard to get any other shape with just 4 petals. But they have 4 petals, and they have 4 sepals. So the 4 petals on top, the 4 sepals underneath. And then they have 6 stamen. So in those stamen, those parts, those male reproductive parts in the middle, they're usually going to have 4 that are tall and kind of at the petal level, or maybe sometimes even longer, and then 2 short. And what's fun with the mustard family is most of the time this is observable with the naked eye. You don't need like a hand lens or a loop to be able to really look close into that flower to start counting stamen, which if you want to do that, go for it. All the more knowledge. So this mustard family, we're thinking 4 petals, 4 sepal, and 6 stamen. And these plants are cool because they do really well in disturbed areas. They're kind of the first to move in, and they tend to pop up around construction sites and landscaping, as you can imagine, those areas that are kind of disturbed and loose soil. Usually a decent amount of sun is being offered. And they have short life cycles, so they're really quick to sprout and grow. They're quick to put up a flower and go to seed. So they're quick, they're up, they're ready to get to business. So mustard family, we're thinking 4 petals, 4 sepals, and 6 stamen. And then these are some local examples to Lewis and Clark Caverns State Park. But it's something that you can always kind of keep in mind when you're out and about in your local area, or even if you're traveling. It goes back to what I was trying to say about how I move a lot, and it's usually every 6 months, sometimes a little less or a little more, but I'm always kind of referring back to this base family knowledge to start being like, that must be a mustard. So these are some common ones of the Lewis and Clark Caverns area. So we have the Nuttall's rockcress in the top left, and then we have whitlow grass and rough wallflower. And those are pretty distinguishable that they have 4 petals. And it's always hard with pictures. The petals are obviously what's going to grab our attention the most, but you'll have to trust me that if we were to go out and handle them in person and flip them over, we would see the 4 sepals underneath, and we could really get down to it and start counting the stamen. And even in the Nuttall's rockcress, you can kind of see you have those 4 that are really high, especially in the leftmost flower. I see 4 stamen and a couple down underneath. So mustard family, 4 petals, 4 sepals, 6 stamen, with 4 tall and 2 short. So that is our mustard family. And we can always come back and talk about this a little later. It's always hard with Zoom calls, as great as they are, to kind of judge where everyone is. So our next family is the mint family. And I particularly like the mint family because there's usually a smell associated. I'm really a sensory person. I like to be able to touch and smell things, and the mint family is a good one for that. I think their most obvious trait is that they have square stems. So if you see something and it's maybe resembling something like on the left, like this horehound, rub your fingers on the stem, and if it kind of like a chunky roll, like you're feeling edges on that stem, chances are that's in the mint family. They have square stems and they're really tactile. So you can definitely feel those ridges. Another big thing aside from the stem is that they pretty much always have opposite leaves. So leaves that are directly across from each other. So we have opposite leaves that are directly across and alternate leaves that are staggered. But in the mint family, they're almost always going to be directly opposite from each other. So for the mint, they have square stems. They have simple opposite leaves, so their leaves are not compound. It doesn't look like one leaf made out of a bunch of little leaves. So just one single leaf, opposite. And they're very aromatic. So if you think about mint that you may have in your kitchen, or minty toothpaste, that mint smell, they're strong. And even in the wild, they're very strong. So if you have a nice sunny warm day and you're out hiking or walking around and you smell something where you're kind of thinking, smells kind of botanical, kind of plant-like, but kind of has an edge to it, chances are there's probably mint around you. They tend to grow in bunches. I've never, not that I can think of, seen just one single mint plant growing off by itself. So that's a lot of plant putting off a lot of smells, and it's an interesting smell, but it's not unpleasant. It's just something like, what is that? But the mint family is very aromatic, and they usually have like these clumps of flowers that are growing, like you see in this this image that's on the left hand part of that, where they're kind of growing right above the leaves and little segments almost. Not always, because you can see with the self-heal on the right that it's all at the top, but a lot of the mints that I've seen in Montana in particular, they kind of have that bunchy segment deal going on. For the flowers in particular, they're kind of hard. They're kind of difficult. They look somewhat similar to another family we'll talk about in a second, because their petals can be united, so they can be fused. They can be multiple petals that are together, and it might look like one. So this is something that I really rely on the stem a lot. I know we're talking about flowers, but I do like to rely on the stem for this mint family, because with those united, those fused petals, it can be a little tricky. But typically the way it works is they have 5 petals, and it's usually 2 lobes on the top and then 3 on the bottom. So they kind of make this staggered look. And then they have 4 stamen with 2 long and 2 short. So, and sometimes these flowers can be very small. So I would normally start with the stem, start to look at the leaves, and then work my way through the flowers if I'm like, I'm not sure, let's keep looking at this. And then even so, the sepal underneath is all united. There's not much deviation between each particular sepal. So stick with the stems, look for the opposite leaves, that really bright aromatic smell. You can even crush a bit of it if you're thinking like a mint julep, where it gets crushed and muddled and it releases that smell. Try those and see what comes through. And usually will lead you to a member of the mint family. So some local examples would be like wild bergamot, wild mint, rough bugleweed. So you can kind of see it has that bunching flowers above those opposite leaves. And even with the bergamot, you can kind of see how they have those fused petals. We have the bigger chunk on the bottom, so that would be 3. You can kind of see the lobes. There's 3 lobes right there. It's just fused together. And then the top 2 petals are just over top, and they're fused together a little bit. But I bet if we could look from another angle, we would see 2 more little lobes. And then you can kind of see, it's a little muddled in that top picture, but there are the 4 stamen with 2 long and 2 short. So that is our mint family. So we're thinking the square stems, opposite leaves, very aromatic, and then you can get into the flower itself, the inflorescence itself, if you need to. So our next one will be the parsley family, and sometimes this is called the carrot family because carrots are in it. And when you see the leaves of these plants and of these flowers, you're thinking, oh, carrot, or maybe even parsley. So these are an interesting family because it contains a couple relatively poisonous plants. But they're also interesting because there's almost no denying that it's a member of the parsley family when you see the flower. They grow in what we call compound umbels. And if you think of like an umbrella, that kind of arching shape with the stays or the support reaching out from that is kind of what we're looking at with these flowers. And they're compound because it's like the umbel is made up of other umbels. So it's not just one flower at the end of each of the stakes of the umbel. So it's one umbrella with a lot of little other umbrellas making it up. So there's a lot of individual flowers involved with these plants, which makes them really big and robust and beautiful, and certainly catches your attention when you're going by. I know of some for sure when I was at Lewis and Clark Cabins for sure. I was walking by and I was like, whoa, what is that? They're so big and they're bright and eye-catching. And it was definitely one of these. So the compound umbels is going to be your tried and true identifier for this parsley family. And sometimes the stems are hollow. So if you were to snap a stem or find a plant that's down and you can kind of metal through it a little bit, sometimes the stems are hollow, but not always. I would use that as kind of like a backup identifier once I'm looking at an umbel. Because it's not always, like I said, this is a usually kind of science. There's always outliers and oddballs. Down in the bottom of that image, the two of our most poisonous plants fall into this family. So we have poison hemlock and water hemlock, and they both fall in, and not related to hemlock like the tree. These are off in their own world, completely different, but they are pretty poisonous. So, and since I heard that Julia's giving a "Can I Eat This?" Talk or hike later on, I don't get into the edible factors of these things. This is just a base level family identification, but it's noted over and over and over again if you have an opportunity to browse through botany in a day. This is a family that you need to know for sure what you're looking at. If it's something that you're going to sample or include in your salad, you need to know for sure. There's been instances where people have think that they found some wild carrot because carrots fall in this family, and probably get pretty sick afterwards. So look for those umbels. They're compound. There are other plants that have the umbel-shaped flowering, but they aren't necessarily so compound. So little umbrellas making up a bigger umbrella is the way I like to think through that one. And some examples. So 9-leaf biscuit root is a great one. There are also like fern-leaf biscuit root that hang out in the same areas, and cow parsnip. Cow parsnip is what I saw while I was out in Lewis and Clark Caverns. And they're big and bright, and they're certainly eye-catching. There's usually a lot of pollinators around. Seems like our bees really like these. There's a lot to choose from. So that is our parsley family. There's big, beautiful compound umbels. May or may not have hollow stems, but can kind of be a good backup. And they do have our poisonous members, so be careful. But they are very nice to look at. So moving on from there, we will go to the pea family. And this is what I was kind of referencing earlier with our mint family, because they can, at first glance, kind of take a similar build, because the pea family is what we call an irregular flower. It doesn't look like that typical flower that maybe a kid would draw for you, or to be honest, I still draw them like that. But those lobed flowers that are very simple and balanced. The pea family has decided that they were going to do their own thing, and I've heard it referred to as a boat, and that's kind of what stuck with me. So they're an irregular flower, and they're made up of 4 primary components: the keel, which is kind of our bottom part of our boat, the wings making up the sides, and then the banners up behind, kind of like a mast. So what's hard is that these pea family flowers can be all different sizes and proportions. So when we look at the pictures on the next slide, I think you'll get a good idea of what I mean by that, but they can be very elongated or they can be compact. But once you see a pea family flower and you kind of get keyed in on it, they're hard to miss. You might have no idea what the plant itself is, but you'll go, that's a pea family member. So, and if you've grown beans or anything, chances are you've seen these before. These plants put out pea-like seed pods. So a lot of those, and they'll be different sizes, but a lot of the flowers that we'll look at, you'll see they have that definite pea-like pod for their seeds. So yeah, they're just kind of funky, but they're really beautiful, and they cover some of I think some of our most remarkable flowers, and they're also one of our larger families. They contain all of the clovers. So any of our yellow or red or purple clovers, all of the clover family is going to fall into the pea family. And if you own a yard that is subject to clover, you have a lot of opportunity to go out and investigate some members of the pea family. And this is one that you might want to have and zoom in, or a handheld lens, or a loop like I was talking about. That might be a good opportunity to get that really up close look at what's going on, so that you can see that keel on the bottom, the wings on the side, and the banners up behind. So they're just a fun irregular family. And here are our examples. So silvery lupin, the lupins fall into this family, and they are a prime example to go look at up close and really see the structure of that plant family. And then all of the milk vetches, most of the vetches just in general, fall into this pea family, so the loose flower milk vetch, and then also wild licorice. And the wild licorice is kind of what I was nudging towards when I said they can be all different proportions. Like this wild licorice, their flowers are very long, so it can kind of throw the proportion of what you're thinking about off just a little bit. But when you look at it head on, or start to manipulate the flower, you'll see that it has the keel, and all the different components start to come together, even if they're just a little bit longer than, say, the lupin. So that is our pea family. Next, we have the lily family, and the lily family is very popular. They are, I think, one of the more showy families, and they're fun because they are a monocot. Most of the plants that we were talking about before, most of the families that were before this, were dicots. So those are the ones that are having the two leaves that are coming up at germination. But the lily family, they are monocots. So they have the one leaf coming up at germination, which is really fun right in spring, right after snow melt, right in the first warm day when things are starting to pop out of the ground. If you're walking around and you just see these single leaves starting to come up, chances are you have a member of the lily family, especially out in these areas. So the lily family is fun because they are tricky. They found a way to look bigger and showier than they may have been at one point, and that is because they have 3 petals. So we're thinking of the petals, the flashy parts on top, and 3 sepals that can look the exact same. So if you're thinking of like a tiger lily, and it looks like it has these big, beautiful, bright orange 6 petals, only 3 of them are truly petals. The other 3 are sepals, and they're so instead of having that leaf-like purpose with chlorophyll, they are increasing their surface area, and they're more bang for their buck by throwing in and changing that pattern to match the petals. So they have the 3 petals and the 3 sepals, usually the same size and color. There is a plant like Trillium is in the lily family, but they, if you think, so Trillium has the 3 petals, usually white, red, sometimes they hybridize and make pinks and whatnot. But then their sepals are green or brown, and they're underlaid underneath. But a lot of the lily family will have all the same size and color for sepals and petals. Because they're a monocot, they tend to have those long leaves with parallel veins running all the way down if you really want to get down into the details of what you're looking at. They also have 6 stamen, and going back to tiger lilies, because they tend to be popular at home or in arrangements. They're the ones that if you've ever gone in to smell the flower, they're leaving pollen and all sorts of stuff all around your nose, because those stamen are normally coming out pretty far from members of the lily family like this. And there are 6 of them. And going back to a few slides ago when we were talking about monocots and dicots, this is definitely a plant family that's going to fall in the numbers of 3, multiples of 3. So 6 stamen. And then what's neat is when we get to the pistil, so the female anatomy of this plant, the pistil, the stigma, the part up top that's trying to be fertilized, kind of is divvied into 3 parts. So it breaks off. It's one piece, but has 3 little ledges on it. And you can kind of see it in the middle of this diagram, what I'm referencing. So it breaks out in 3, and that's just one of the fun details. Sure, it'll help you identify, but it's just like these plants really go down to the numbers and having multiples of 3, even down to like the division of their stigma. So that's what we're looking at with this family. They have a lot of plants that used to be in this family and then were pulled out and reclassified. So this is kind of an odd one where things that used to be in the lily family were just maybe a little bit more genetically diverse than what they wanted, and they threw them in a different family. So just kind of keep that in mind, especially if you have an older field guide book. It might not reflect that. And I mean, that's okay. You'll still know what it is. But if you're wanting to get really technical with something, this family does have members that have been moved around a little bit. So examples of this are yellow bells, which are a sure indicator of spring for me. They're usually one of the first to pop up. They're a little bit, you have to kind of manipulate and hold them to see what's going on, since they do tend to hang downward. And then we also have mountain death camas, definitely in the lily family. And this is a really great picture to show that it has those 3 petals on the top, the 3 sepals that match exactly that are underneath, and then it has the 6 stamen hanging up in the middle. And then the nodding onion is another one. So those ones are really small, but they're in the lily family. If you get a close look at them, you'll see that division on how everything kind of falls into its pattern here. Other really great examples of this, other than the tiger lily, because they're so accessible, especially in stores, is Mariposa lilies. They are very tricky in their petals and sepals if you didn't know which was on top or on bottom, because they're completely mimicked and meshed all the way around. But more surface area, more show. So that is our lily family. So we're thinking multiples of 3 because it's a monocot. We can see in our yellow bell those long, elongated, linear leaves with the parallel veins that will run all the way down. 3 petals, 3 sepals, 6 stamen, and the stigma on the pistil that's divvied into 3. So really fun, beautiful family. I think I'm going to say that about all of them. I like them all. And then we have our rose family. And the rose family is fun because this is a pretty heavy fruit-bearing family. We have a lot of different opportunities, especially in Montana, to see different rose family members. And they I feel like they're fairly consistent. They are noted by having 5 petals, so they're pretty easy to count. You don't necessarily have to worry about fused petals here. So 5 petals, 5 sepals underneath, and you can think classic rose with this, with those pointy, almost kind of scraggly sepals underneath, those leaf-looking structures underneath. And then numerous stamen on the inside, just a whole bunch. You can count them out if you're trying to separate different species and figure out what's going on. But just saying, for a general rose family member, a lot of stamen right packed in the middle. This this family is really reliant on pollinators being involved, so they're really upping their opportunity by having a lot of stamen out there. Their leaves, for the most part, are going to be kind of that oval shape that you're seeing on the left image of the Virginia wild rose, oval edge with serrated edges. So think like a serrated knife. It has like little teeth. So oval shape, serrated edges, 5 petals, 5 sepals, and a lot of stamen packed in the middle. The raspberries are doing their own thing with their leaves, but you can still see that they do have a little bit in each of the lobes. They're a little bit rounded, and they have the serrated edge as well. So this covers plants like Prairie Smoke, and I threw that in there because it's kind of funny. You don't see kind of this shape for very long. They're quick to go into their smoke stage, where they have that fluff, that wind dispersed part opened up. But Prairie Smoke falls into this family. The shrubby cinquefoil is in there, and one of my favorites is wood strawberry, or wild strawberry. So now is the time when they are really out and they're hoping to produce some fruit soon. So they're a great one to look at up close, because chances are you will have a lot of them around you. And they have very distinct 5 petals. You can flip over and look at the 5 sepals underneath, and multiple stamen right in the middle. So that is our rose family. And that leaves our last family, which is a huge family, and that is the Aster, or sometimes called the sunflower family. And this is also an interesting one. They cover a lot. They're the largest family of flowering plants within the northern latitude. Otherwise, the orchid family kind of takes it for everywhere else. But up in these northern latitudes, they're the largest family of flowering plants. And they're cool because what looks like one flower, like if you're thinking of like a sunflower, what looks like one flower is actually a ton of little flowers all packed together. So they are identified as that disc shape. Every now and then you have something that goes genetically a little wonky and they make weird shapes, but for the most part, they have that disc shape, and everything that you're looking at in that disc is a flower. So the petals are individual flowers. All those bumpy bits in the middle are individual flowers, and we can break those into 2 different types. So along the outside is the ray flower. So like think of sunshine rays on the outside, the ray flowers. Those are each individual flowers. And then we have the disc flowers right in the middle, making that usually like the brown part of the sunflower, brown-eyed Susan, any of that. So these are recognizable for a distance. With me walking along and go, that's an aster, that's an aster, that's an aster. A lot of things fall into this family, but there are some mimics that are not truly asters, and a good way to kind of weed that out is to look on the back side. And they have layers of bracts, which are kind of like sepals, but they almost look like scales kind of layered on the back of the flower. And they usually have at least 2 layers of those bracts, those green bracts on the back. Dandelions are another great example of this family. That's almost all, it's a ton of little flowers. If you have an opportunity to pick a dandelion and maybe open it up, and you can see all the little individual flowers up close. So our aster family. they're big and showy. Arrowleaf balsam root is a great one. Blanket flower, when they start coming up, is also great. And I threw in yarrow because they are just a small version of this Aster family. I feel like a lot of the ones that we look at are really big and bright, and they come up early. Yarrow is also an aster, so they're made up of those ray flowers on the outside. I'm sorry this picture's a little fuzzy now, but you can kind of see all those disc flowers right packed in the middle of our top right-hand photo of yarrow. So multiple, this is a composite flower, one flower made up of a lot of different flowers. So that covers our 8 families, and there are a lot of other families. That's not by any means all of them, but that's a lot of the general ones that we see. And it's just good knowledge to kind of keep tucked in the back of your head, especially if you're out milling about and don't have any references on you. I always like to file things away, like, what was that yellow aster flower that I saw in this kind of environment? And I can go back and start to put the clues together later. It's also nice because if you have a field guide that's divvied by family, it makes it really quick. If you know for sure something's in the P family, you can just skip right to that section. Yeah, so that is kind of those 8 core families. A lot of this is pulled right from Botany in a Day by Thomas Elpel, which I know is a book that can be sold in our Montana State Park bookstores, if for the parks that have stores. I've seen it in a handful of the park stores. And that's what I have for all of you. So I hope that kind of gives you a new base layer of information on how to kind of weed out different families, where plants are falling. And it's cool because once you start to build that and start to recognize those families, you can start to plug in that information for what that means for where that plant's living. You can start to pull different clues together. Like, oh, I always see this particular plant and normally this family in this one type of ecosystem or little niche. So yeah, we'll have some time to answer some questions if you have any. And I hope whether you're new to investigating flowers or long time with it, that maybe you picked up something or had a good refresher. And yeah, thanks so much for joining us and giving us some time on your Friday afternoon, your Friday evening. Get myself back to the chat.
Before we jump into questions, we do offer Botany in a Day by Thomas Elpel at our bookstore. So if you want to come pick that up, we do sell it.
Awesome. All right. Emily, I threw you back as host, so that's on your end. Yeah. Oh, I see. Which do bumblebees prefer most? And I just generally want to say all of them. But you can even, Botany in a Day, I believe, even has a section that will start to divvy out different colors and kind of what they tend to attract. Like some of the blues and, oh gosh, I don't want to botch this, but I know blue for sure can be pretty privy to, blues and browns tend to be mammal driven, and then those bright colors, whites and oranges, yellows, tend to be more insect driven. So there's still some more curious knowledge behind all of that that you can certainly delve into. And like I said, I think Botany in a Day does have a section on that. Ooh, Indian paintbrush. I can't say that I know, and I feel like I just looked at this too. I'm sorry, I don't know that one right off the top of my head. And a couple of people are asking about this recording and past presentations. Emily, do you want to field that for me?
Yeah, these will be recorded. We'll have them up on the Montana State Parks YouTube channel before too long, just as soon as we get access to that and can edit these videos up.
Awesome. Oh, so I went ahead and looked it up for you. Indian paintbrush falls into the broomrape family, which I don't know a lot about. I focus a lot on those 8 core families. Just because they're quick and I've spent a decent amount of time with it, but there are some fun ones out there. Figwort, yeah, it looks like they just recently renamed it. Great, well, I think we're at the end of it, so thank you all so much for joining us, and hope you have some fun getting out and looking at some flowers. It's definitely the perfect time of year for that. Enjoy where you are.